The glass was already at his lips. One swallow, and Nathaniel Whitmore would be dead before the toasts ended. 60 guests watched Elizabeth Carter, a healer's daughter bought into marriage for money nobody admitted was blood money, lunge across the altar and strike the cup from his hand. Wine hit the marble floor like a wound opening. The room gasped. Somewhere in that crowd someone had wanted him dead, and now they knew she wasn't as powerless as they'd assumed. If you're watching from wherever you are tonight, drop your city below, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very last word. The bells of St. Andrew's Church had not finished ringing when Elizabeth Carter understood with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life reading the small signs other people missed that something in the room was wrong. It was not the guests. Guests always stared at a wedding like hers, the poor bride, the dying groom, the marriage that had been arranged over ledgers instead of love. She had grown used to stares. She had grown used to being looked at the way a farmer looks at a horse he suspects has been sold to him lame. It was the wine. She noticed it the way she noticed everything sideways without meaning to, the way her father had taught her before Virginia society decided he was a criminal instead of a healer. A faint bitterness under the sweetness. A smell like almonds that did not belong in a summer wedding cup. She had smelled it once before years ago in a dying woman's sick room, and her father had gone pale and said one word only. Poison. Nathaniel Whitmore lifted the glass toward his mouth, and the whole church seemed to lean forward with him, waiting for the man everyone already called half a ghost to seal his fate with a sip of celebration. Elizabeth moved before she decided to move. "Stop," she said, and her voice cracked through the church like a shot. She crossed the space between them in 3 strides, skirts catching on the altar rail, and struck the cup from his hand. It hit the marble, and shattered wine spreading dark and red across the white stone, like something already spilled that could never be undone. For 1 full second, nobody breathed. Then the church exploded into noise. "She's mad." Struck him at his own wedding. "That family was always cursed. I told you." Nathaniel stared down at her, one hand still raised where the glass had been. His face unreadable in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. He was 35 years old, and looked in that moment every day of it, and older the illness that had been eating him for 2 years, carved into hollows under his eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and his voice was quiet in a church gone suddenly dangerously silent. "Would you care to explain yourself?" She could hear Charles Bennet's voice rising somewhere behind the groom's shoulder, smooth as poured oil. "Nathaniel, the girl is clearly overwhelmed. Perhaps we ought to—" "I asked her," Nathaniel said, not turning. "Not you, Charles." Elizabeth's hands were shaking. She looked down at the wine soaking into the white stone at the shards of crystal, glittering like ice, and forced her voice to hold steady, even as every eye in Virginia's finest families bore down on her like weight. "If you had drunk that, sir," she said, "you would not have survived the night." A woman somewhere in the 3rd pew laughed short and disbelieving. "Poison at a wedding, listen to her. The healer's daughter fancies herself a physician now. She fancies herself many things," Charles said, stepping forward. At last his hand settling on Nathaniel's shoulder with the easy familiarity of a man who had run this household longer than the bride had been alive. "Nathaniel, you're unwell." "Perhaps the excitement." "I am unwell," Nathaniel said, "which is precisely why a bitterness under sweet wine concerns me more than it concerns you, Charles." Something moved behind Charles Bennet's eyes so brief Elizabeth might have imagined it if she hadn't spent 19 years learning to read faces the way other women read scripture. Not confusion, not concern, calculation. He recovered his composure in the space of a breath, spreading his hands in a gesture of patient reasonableness that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. "Then let us have the wine examined by all means, if it will settle everyone's nerves. Though I confess I don't know what a healer's daughter smells in a cup that our physician missed." "Our physician," Elizabeth said before she could stop herself, "has been treating Mr. Whitmore for 2 years without once curing him, sir." "Perhaps that ought to concern you more than my nose does." A murmur ran through the pews, half scandal, half something that might have been reluctant approval. Nathaniel's mouth did something at the corner that was almost a smile, gone before it could be confirmed. "Bring the wine to the kitchen," he said to no one in particular, to everyone. "All of it." Nothing served today leaves this church until it's accounted for." "Nathaniel," Charles began. "That is not a request, Charles." The church emptied slowly, guests filing out in clusters of whispered speculation, casting looks back at the bride who stood alone at the altar, in a gown too fine for the life she'd actually lived, her hands still trembling from what she'd done and what she'd very nearly failed to prevent. Nathaniel did not offer her his arm as they walked to the carriage. He walked 2 steps ahead of her, silent, his jaw set in a way that told her he was furious or frightened or both, and did not yet know which. She had known him 3 weeks. She had married him 4 hours ago. And already she understood that surviving this house would require more than any dowry, more than any beauty she did not possess. It would require everything her father had taught her before Virginia decided the Carter name meant nothing but scandal. The Whitmore estate sat 2 miles outside the town proper, white columns rising out of green Virginia summer, like something too grand to be real tobacco fields, stretching gold-green to the tree line, the whole property humming with the particular silence of a place used to being obeyed rather than questioned. Elizabeth had grown up in 4 rented rooms above her father's apothecary shop. She had never in her life stood in a hallway wide enough to hold her whole childhood home. "You'll take the east chamber." Nathaniel said the first words he'd spoken since the church. He did not look at her. "Mrs. Alden will show you. I have matters to attend to." "Mr. Whitmore?" She caught his sleeve before she could stop herself and felt him go rigid at the touch. "The wine will be examined," he said, "as I said it would." "You don't believe me." He turned then, and for the first time she saw not the dying man Virginia gossiped about, but something harder underneath, something that had survived 2 years of doctors telling him he was already halfway into his grave. "I believe," he said carefully, "that you struck a glass from my hand in front of every family that matters in this county on the day I married you to secure this estate's future, and that whatever your reasons, the damage to my name is done, regardless of whether you were right. Would you rather I'd let you drink it?" "I'd rather," he said, and something raw moved under the words, "that in 2 years of doctors and remedies and my own family waiting for me to finally die, no one thought to tell me someone might be helping the illness along. And now my bride tells me so at the altar in front of everyone, and I am meant to simply believe her." Elizabeth held his gaze. She thought of her father dragged from his own shop by men who'd decided his medicine had killed a patient. It hadn't his name destroyed by rumor before a single fact was checked. She thought of what it cost to be disbelieved by people who had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth. "You don't have to believe me yet," she said quietly. "But ask your physician why a man improves for weeks and then collapses again every time his treatment changes. Ask him that, and then decide whether I'm mad." She did not wait for his answer. She turned and walked toward the east chamber, and if her hands were shaking again, she made certain he did not see it. Mrs. Alden was a broad, gray-haired woman who managed the household with the brisk efficiency of someone who had buried more Whitmores than she cared to count, and she looked at Elizabeth the way most of the staff would look at her in the days that followed, with a wariness that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't far from it either. "You'll want for nothing here, ma'am," Mrs. Alden said, setting a basin of water on the washstand. "Whatever else is said of this house." "What is said of it?" Mrs. Alden's mouth thinned. "That it's cursed, ma'am. 2 Whitmore men dead of the same wasting sickness in 20 years and now a third one fading the same way. Folks talk." "Do they talk about Mr. Bennett?" The older woman's eyes flicked up sharp and sudden. "Why would they talk about Mr. Bennett, ma'am? He's run this estate for how long?" "Since old Mr. Whitmore passed. 8 years now. Mr. Charles has been loyal as a hound to this family the whole while." But something in her voice had gone careful the way people speak when they are choosing not to say a thing rather than confirming they don't know it. Elizabeth filed that away the way she filed everything quietly without comment, the way her father had taught her to note a patient's smallest tremor before it became a symptom worth naming aloud. "Thank you, Mrs. Alden." "You're welcome, ma'am." The housekeeper paused at the door. "For what it's worth, that was a brave thing you did today. Foolish, maybe, but brave." It was the first kind word anyone in that house had offered her. That night Elizabeth did not sleep. She waited until the house had gone fully quiet, until the last candle in the servants' quarters had guttered out, and then she rose in her nightclothes and made her way down the east corridor toward the room she'd been told was Nathaniel's private study, the room Mrs. Alden had mentioned in passing where his medicines were kept and measured out each morning by Charles Bennett himself, a duty no physician had ever questioned, because Charles had always insisted on personally overseeing his cousin's care. His cousin's care? The words sat wrong in her chest. The study door was unlocked. She supposed a dying man's medicine chest did not need much guarding, when everyone had already decided nature would finish the work regardless. Inside, arranged with the same fastidious order as everything else in Charles Bennett's domain, sat a row of small brown bottles, each labeled in careful handwriting for the fever, for the weakness, for the nerves. Elizabeth uncorked the first and lifted it to her nose, the way her father had taught her, before he lost everything before the world decided a healer's daughter's opinion was worth less than a gentleman physician's signature. Beneath the medicinal bitterness faint but unmistakable to a nose trained since childhood, sat the same thread of almond sweetness she'd caught in the wedding wine. Her hand went still around the bottle. Interesting hour for a new bride to be exploring her husband's private study. Elizabeth turned so fast the bottle nearly slipped from her fingers. Charles Bennett stood in the doorway, a single candle in his hand, his face arranged into an expression of mild, almost paternal concern that did not reach his eyes. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "No." He agreed pleasantly, stepping into the room. "I don't imagine you could after the spectacle you made of yourself today." He glanced at the bottle still in her hand, and something flickered behind his composure before he smoothed it away. "That's a tonic for Nathaniel's nerves. Prescribed by Dr. Whitfield himself. I'd be careful handling another man's medicine. Mrs. Whitmore, people might begin to wonder why." "People might wonder a great many things, Mr. Bennett," she said, setting the bottle down with deliberate steadiness, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she feared he could hear it. "About the wine, about the medicine, about a man who's improved and worsened by turns for 2 years under the exact same careful supervision." The candlelight caught something cold in his face for just an instant there, and gone quick as a snake retreating into grass. "You're a bold woman," he said softly. "Your father was bold too, as I recall. Bold and then ruined, and then dead of a broken heart in a debtor's cell, wasn't he? Boldness has a cost in this world, Mrs. Whitmore. I'd think carefully about whether you're prepared to pay it twice." Elizabeth's blood went cold, but she made herself hold his gaze without flinching, the way she'd learned to hold the gaze of every man who'd ever looked at her and seen only a ruined name instead of a person. "Is that a threat, Mr. Bennett?" "It's a kindness," he said, smiling now, and the smile was somehow worse than any threat could have been. "Go to bed, Mrs. Whitmore. Tend to your husband's comfort and leave the medicine to those qualified to administer it. I'd hate for anything else, unfortunate, to happen in this house so soon after your wedding." He held the door for her with exaggerated courtesy, and Elizabeth walked past him with her chin lifted and her hands clenched hard in her skirts to keep them from shaking, and she did not look back, even when she felt his eyes on her the entire length of the corridor. Only when she reached her own chamber and shut the door did she allow herself to sink against the wood, breathing hard, her mind racing through everything she'd seen and everything Charles Bennett's carefully pleasant threat had told her without meaning to. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't once denied it. Then, she did not see Nathaniel again until the following morning, when he found her in the small garden behind the kitchen, cutting herbs she recognized from her father's store's feverfew and something for the nerves that grew wild near the fence line. "You're gathering medicine," he said, and there was no accusation in it this time, only a kind of tired curiosity. "I don't trust the medicine already in this house," Elizabeth said, not looking up from her work. "I thought I'd make my own." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. When she finally glanced up, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, not the wariness of the church, not the anger of the carriage ride. Something closer to a man standing at the edge of a decision he wasn't yet ready to make out loud. "Dr. Whitfield examined the wine," he said finally. "He found nothing." Elizabeth's stomach dropped, though she'd half expected it. Of course he didn't. You don't sound surprised. I'm not. She set down the herbs and met his eyes fully for the first time since the wedding. Mr. Whitmore, I would ask you one question, and I would ask that you answer it honestly, even if the answer frightens you. Who chooses your physician? Who pays him? Who stands in the room every time your medicine is measured? Nathaniel's face went very still. Charles arranges all of it, he said slowly. He has since my father died. It's always been Charles. And has your health ever improved? Elizabeth asked quietly. In the weeks when Charles Bennet was away from this estate, she watched the question land in him like a stone dropped into still water. Watched the ripples of it move across his face. Disbelief, then something closer to dawning horror, then a kind of grief so old and so deep she understood in that instant that some small part of him had wondered this himself for a very long time, and had never once let himself ask it aloud. Elizabeth. Her name for the first time, not Mrs. Whitmore, not wife, just her name, quiet and unsteady. If what you're suggesting is true, I don't know yet what's true, she said. I only know what I smelled in that wine, and what I smelled again last night in a bottle marked for your nerves. And I know that Charles Bennet found me holding it and told me my father died bold and ruined, and that boldness has a cost. He didn't deny anything, Mr. Whitmore. A man who's done nothing wrong denies it the first breath he's given to speak. Nathaniel sat down heavily on the garden bench, and for a moment he looked less like the master of a great Virginia estate, and more like exactly what he was, a man who had spent 2 years believing he was dying of nature's cruelty, only to be told the cruelty might have had a hand behind it, wearing his own family's face. Why would he? Nathaniel said, and his voice cracked on it. He's my cousin Elizabeth. He's run this house since my father died. He's the only family I have left who inherits this estate, Elizabeth said gently, if you die without an heir. The silence that followed was long enough that Elizabeth could hear the wind moving through the tobacco fields beyond the garden wall, long enough that she began to fear she had pushed him too far too fast, on a day when the whole world had already turned upside down for him once. I need proof, Nathaniel finally said low and rough. Not smell, not suspicion. Proof before I accuse the man who raised me half my life of trying to kill me. Then help me get it, Elizabeth said. Let me examine the medicine properly. Let me watch how it's measured, who touches it, when your symptoms worsen, and when they ease. Give me 2 weeks. Mr. Whitmore and I will either prove you a healthy man, being poisoned by someone he trusts, or I will prove myself a fool, not worth the dowry you paid for me. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Really looked the way no one had looked at Elizabeth Carter in the 2 years since her father's ruin, not as a scandal to be managed, or a bargain reluctantly struck, but as a person who might against every reasonable expectation be telling him the truth. 2 weeks, he said finally. And Elizabeth. He caught her hand before she could turn away his grip, weak but earnest, the first true warmth he'd shown her since the wedding. Thank you. For the wine. Whatever else comes of this, thank you for the wine. She did not tell him in that moment that stopping the wine had been the easy part. The harder truth, the one she carried alone as she walked back into a house full of people who had already decided her name meant scandal and fortune hunter, and mad, was that Charles Bennet now knew exactly what she suspected, exactly what she'd seen, and exactly how much he stood to lose if she was right. And men like Charles Bennet, in Elizabeth's experience, did not wait patiently to be caught. That evening, as she sat alone in the east chamber going over her father's old notes on toxic herbs by candlelight, she heard footsteps pause outside her door, unhurried, deliberate, lingering a moment too long before moving on. She did not open the door to see who it was. She already knew. The 2 weeks Elizabeth had asked for began the next morning, and by noon of the first day, she understood that surviving them would be harder than she'd promised Nathaniel it would. She found Mrs. Alden in the kitchen, elbow deep in flour, and asked as casually as she could manage whether she might be permitted to help prepare Mr. Whitmore's meals herself. The older woman's hands went still. That's Charles's arrangement, ma'am. Cook prepares the meals. Charles sees to the medicine. I'd like to change that. You'd like to change 8 years of how this house runs on your second day as mistress of it." Mrs. Alden wiped her hands slowly on her apron, studying Elizabeth with something between disbelief and reluctant respect. "Folks already whisper you're touched in the head, ma'am. Forgive my plainness. Taking over the kitchen from Mr. Bennet won't quiet that talk." "Let them whisper," Elizabeth said. "I'd rather be called mad and have my husband alive than be called agreeable and bury him." Something shifted in Mrs. Alden's face. Then, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Elizabeth felt for the first time since the wedding that she had found one ally inside these walls. "There's a boy," Mrs. Alden said, lowering her voice. "Tommy, works the stable. Got thrown from a horse 3 weeks back, broke his arm bad, and Dr. Whitfield said it so poorly the boy's been fevered and in pain ever since. Charles won't spare the coin for another doctor. Says a stable boy's arm ain't worth the trouble. Take me to him." Tommy was perhaps 12 years old, thin as a fence post. His arm splinted crooked and hot to the touch, his face gray with a fever that had clearly been building for days. He flinched when Elizabeth knelt beside his pallet in the stable loft, flinched harder when she reached for his arm. "I ain't got money for doctoring, ma'am," he said, voice thin. "Best you go on." "I'm not asking for money," Elizabeth said gently. "I'm asking you to trust me for 5 minutes. Can you do that?" The boy looked at her with the wary eyes of someone who had learned early that trust was a luxury poor folks couldn't often afford, and Elizabeth recognized that look because she had worn it herself every day since her father's ruin. "You're the one struck the wine glass," he said slowly. "I am. Everybody says you're mad. Everybody said my father was a murderer too, and he never killed a soul in his life," Elizabeth said, unwrapping the splint with careful fingers. "People say a great many things, Tommy, and precious few of them are true." The arm beneath the linen was swollen and badly set, the bone-knitting crooked infection blooming red and angry along a shallow cut Dr. Whitfield had apparently not bothered to clean before splinting over it. "This needs to be reset," she said quietly. "It will hurt. I won't lie to you about that. But if it's left as it is, you could lose the arm or worse." Tommy's jaw trembled, but he nodded. "Do it." It took the better part of an hour cleaning the wound, resetting the bone with Mrs. Alden holding the boy steady while he bit down on a strip of leather and wept without shame, packing the injury with feverfew and yarrow from Elizabeth's own gathered herbs, binding it fresh and true. When it was done, Tommy lay pale and exhausted, but breathing easier, the fever already seeming to loosen its grip. "You'll mend," Elizabeth told him. "Rest and drink the tea Mrs. Alden brings you, and in a month you'll be back on that horse better than before." The boy looked at her with something raw and unguarded in his face. "Why'd you help me? Ain't nobody helps stable boys." "Because somebody should have helped my father," Elizabeth said simply, "and nobody did." Word of the stable boy's arm traveled through the servants' quarters faster than Elizabeth could have hoped. By evening, a young kitchen maid was quietly asking whether the new mistress might look at her mother's cough. By the next morning, 2 more of the household staff had found excuses to pass near Elizabeth's chamber, watching her with the particular curiosity of people revising a judgment they'd made too quickly. Charles Bennet noticed too. She felt his eyes on her across the supper table that night, felt the careful, pleasant chill of his attention, even as he spoke warmly to Nathaniel about estate matters, ledgers, tobacco prices, nothing that mattered, and everything that was meant to remind her exactly whose house this had always been. "You've been busy today, Mrs. Whitmore," he said when the conversation lulled. "Tending to the stable boy's arm, I hear. Quite the physician you're becoming." "Someone had to be," Elizabeth said evenly, "since the one this house pays seems to have missed a fair number of things." Nathaniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Charles's smile didn't waver, but something behind it tightened. "Dr. Whitfield has served this family faithfully for 15 years. "Faithfully," Elizabeth repeated, "isn't the same as competently, Mr. Bennet, but I imagine you know that better than anyone." The silence that followed had teeth in it. Nathaniel looked between his wife and his cousin with the expression of a man watching two currents collide beneath water that looked calm on the surface, and when Charles finally excused himself from the table, early citing estate correspondence that needed attention, Elizabeth felt, rather than saw the door close a little harder than it needed to. "You shouldn't provoke him," Nathaniel said quietly once they were alone. "I'm not provoking him," Elizabeth said. "I'm watching him. There's a difference, though. I'll grant you he seems not to enjoy either one." The next several days settled into a rhythm that felt, despite everything, almost peaceful. Elizabeth rose before dawn to gather herbs, while the dew still clung to the fence lines, spent her mornings quietly cataloging every bottle in Charles's medicine chest, smelling, tasting the barest trace on her fingertip, comparing what she found against her father's careful notes on toxic herbs, the ones that mimicked ordinary tonics closely enough to fool any physician who wasn't looking for them. She found what she was looking for on the fourth day. The bottle marked for the nerves held beneath its bitter medicinal base an unmistakable trace of foxglove. Enough in the doses Charles had apparently been measuring nightly into Nathaniel's evening tea, to slow a weakened heart toward failure so gradually that any physician would call it simply the progress of a wasting illness, rather than what it actually was. Her hands shook as she recorded it in the small notebook she'd begun keeping hidden beneath the false bottom of her travel trunk. Foxglove. Measured nightly. Symptoms worsen by morning ease, slightly by midday, when the previous dose has partly cleared the body. This is not illness. This is a slow, careful murder, timed to look exactly like nature taking its course. She needed more than her own testimony to prove it. She needed the bottles themselves, and she needed Nathaniel well enough and skeptical enough of his own household to see it laid out before him in a way even a lifetime of trusting Charles Bennett couldn't argue away. That evening, she found Nathaniel in his study, staring at a ledger without reading it, his face drawn with the particular exhaustion of a man carrying a suspicion he wasn't yet ready to name aloud. "You look unwell," she said. "I feel," Nathaniel said slowly, "like a man who has spent 2 years grieving his own death only to discover the grief might have had an author. I don't know which is worse, Elizabeth, dying of nature or dying of my own blindness." "You're not dying," she said. "Not if I can help it." He looked up at her, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the wariness of the wedding day, not the cautious gratitude of the garden. Something closer to a man beginning against every instinct 2 years of illness had trained into him to hope. "Why do you care so much?" he asked. "You didn't choose this marriage any more than I did. You could let nature or Charles or whatever this truly is take its course, and you'd inherit a widow's portion and be free of an arrangement neither of us wanted." Elizabeth considered the question honestly, because he deserved that much. "Because I watched my father die, believing the world had already decided who he was before it bothered to ask what was true," she said quietly. "I watched good people turn their backs on him because it was easier than doubting a story they'd already been told. I won't watch that happen to another person while I have the power to stop it. Even a person I hardly know. Even a marriage I didn't choose." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "My father used to say a man's character shows plainest in the things he does when no one's grateful for them yet." "Then I suppose we'll find out what mine is," Elizabeth said. "Because Charles Bennett is certainly not grateful." The turning point came on the 6th night, and it came the way Elizabeth had least expected it, not through Charles, but through fire. She woke to the smell of smoke and the distant, urgent clanging of the estate's fire bell, and by the time she'd thrown a shawl over her nightclothes and reached the corridor, half the household was already awake and running servants shouting the acrid orange glow of flame visible through the east-facing windows. "The stables," someone was shouting. "The stables are burning." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. Tommy. She ran without thinking. Skirts hiked in her fists down the back stairs and out into a night gone hot and bright with fire. The stable roof already fully alight, horses screaming inside stable hands, and household staff forming a desperate bucket line from the well that would never move fast enough to matter. "Tommy's still in the loft," a groom shouted. "His arm he can't climb down fast with that splint." Elizabeth didn't remember deciding to run toward the burning building. She only remembered the heat hitting her face like a wall, the smoke stinging her eyes to blindness, the sound of Nathaniel's voice somewhere behind her shouting her name with a fear so raw it cracked. "Elizabeth, Elizabeth, don't!" She was already inside. The smoke was thicker in the loft, the air burning in her throat, and she found Tommy pressed into the far corner, coughing, his splinted arm clutched to his chest, too frightened and too injured to climb down the ladder alone. "I've got you," she said, hauling him up with strength she didn't know she had, dragging him toward the ladder as a support beam somewhere above them groaned and shifted, raining sparks. "Hold on to my shoulders. We're going down together right now, do you understand me?" The boy nodded, terrified, and clung to her as she half carried, half lowered him down the ladder, the heat at her back so fierce she could feel it through her nightclothes. And when they finally burst out into the cool night air, strong hands caught them both. Nathaniel's hands, his face white with a terror that had nothing to do with his own illness and everything to do with hers. "You could have died," he said, hauling her back from the collapsing structure as the roof finally gave way behind them in a roar of sparks and flame. "You fool woman, you could have burned alive in there. He's 12 years old." Elizabeth gasped, coughing smoke from her lungs, still holding Tommy upright against her side. "I wasn't going to leave him." Nathaniel stared at her, soot-streaked, singed at the hem, shaking with adrenaline and smoke, and something in his face broke open in a way Elizabeth would remember for the rest of her life. A look that had nothing to do with gratitude, and everything to do with something neither of them was ready to name. "You could have died," he said again, quieter this time, and pulled her against his chest, without seeming to decide to do it. One hand cradling the back of her smoke-tangled hair, his heart hammering against her ear, hard enough that she could feel unmistakably that this was a man very much alive. Whatever Charles Bennett's foxglove had been trying to do to change that, it was Charles's voice that broke the moment. "A terrible accident," he said, arriving at the edge of the firelight with his own coat thrown hastily over his nightshirt, his expression arranged into perfect, practiced concern. "The lantern in the stable must have tipped. Thank God everyone's safe." Elizabeth pulled back from Nathaniel just enough to look at Charles directly, and something cold and certain settled into her chest. "There was no lantern lit in that stable tonight, Mr. Bennett," she said. "I checked myself not 2 hours ago when I brought Tommy his evening tea." Charles's smile didn't move, but his eyes went flat and careful. "Then I imagine someone was careless with a pipe, or a spark from the kitchen fire carried further than expected. These things happen, Mrs. Whitmore. Accidents happen." "Do they?" Elizabeth said softly. "Happen quite so often around this family, Mr. Bennett." The fire crackled and roared behind them, throwing long, shifting shadows across Charles Bennett's face. And for just a moment, a fraction of a second gone as quickly as it appeared, Elizabeth saw something in his expression that was not concern at all. It was fury. Nathaniel insisted over Elizabeth's protests that Dr. Whitfield examine her for burns and smoke sickness, and it was in the quiet aftermath of that examination, Elizabeth bandaged at the wrist, where a spark had caught her, sitting wrapped in a blanket by the study fire, while the smell of smoke still clung to her hair, that Nathaniel finally said the words she'd been waiting 6 days to hear. "I want to see the bottles," he said. "All of them. Tonight." "Nathaniel, say that again." He was watching her with a strange intensity. "You called me Nathaniel just now, and Elizabeth tonight. A boy is alive, because you ran into a burning building for him, and my cousin stood there and lied to my face about a lantern that was never lit. I've spent 2 years believing the worst thing in my life was dying slowly of my father's same illness. I would very much like to know tonight whether the worst thing in my life has actually been standing beside me at supper for 8 years. Elizabeth retrieved her notebook and the bottle she'd hidden from the medicine chest and laid them both before him with hands that had finally mercifully stopped shaking. "Foxglove," she said, "in the nerve tonic. Enough to slow the heart, not enough to kill outright in a single dose, enough only to make a healthy man sicken slowly over months in a pattern that looks exactly like the same wasting illness that killed your father and his father before him. Nathaniel, I don't think you're cursed. I think you're being poisoned exactly the way I believe your father may have been." Nathaniel's face went the color of ash. "My father died at 41, he said hoarsely. "Charles was 20 when it happened. He inherited nothing. Then my father left everything to me, a boy of 13 with Charles as steward, until I came of age. Charles has run this estate for 22 years, Elizabeth. If what you're suggesting is true, then he's been managing this family's slow death for 2 generations." Elizabeth finished quietly, "And standing to inherit everything the moment there's no Whitmore left standing between him and the deed." The study door opened without warning, and both of them turned to find Charles Bennet standing in the frame, his face unreadable in the firelight, his eyes moving from the bottle on the desk to the notebook beside it, to the two of them sitting close together, in a way that told him plainly exactly what had been discovered. For a long, terrible moment, nobody spoke. "Charles," Nathaniel said finally, his voice low and dangerous in a way Elizabeth had not yet heard from him. "Sit down. We have a great deal to discuss." Charles Bennet's expression shifted, the pleasant mask sliding just for an instant into something colder and far more honest before he smoothed it back into place with practiced ease. "I don't know what lies that woman has been filling your head with," he said, "but I have served this family faithfully since before you could walk unassisted, Nathaniel, and I won't stand here and be accused by a healer's ruined daughter of—" "Sit down, Charles." The command in Nathaniel's voice startled even Elizabeth. Charles hesitated, weighing his options, and then, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had not survived 22 years of quiet manipulation by acting rashly, he lowered himself into the chair across the desk. "Explain the foxglove," Nathaniel said. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The bottle, marked for my nerves, mixed nightly by your own hand for as long as I can remember. Elizabeth found foxglove in it, Charles. Enough to explain 2 years of an illness Dr. Whitfield never once cured. Explain it to me." Charles's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "Foxglove is a common ingredient in nerve tonics in careful doses. Perhaps your physician erred in his measurements. That's hardly proof of—" "My physician," Nathaniel said, "who you selected, who you've paid personally out of estate funds for 15 years. Who has never once in 2 years of my declining health suggested a second opinion or a change in treatment. That physician, Charles. You're letting a hysterical woman turn you against the only family you have left." Charles snapped, and the mask slipped further, revealing something colder underneath. "I raised you, Nathaniel. I taught you to ride. I sat with you through your father's funeral. I have given 22 years of my life to protecting this estate, while you were too busy being sick to manage it yourself, and this is my thanks. Accusations based on the word of a woman who married you for your money, and can't stand the thought of sharing your trust with anyone else." "I didn't marry him for money," Elizabeth said quietly. "I married him because my family had none left, and this was the arrangement offered to me. But I've spent 6 days in this house trying to keep him alive, Mr. Bennet, while you've spent them measuring poison into his tea and setting fire to buildings to silence a 12-year-old boy who might have seen something he shouldn't have. That is a monstrous accusation. Is it?" Nathaniel's voice cracked like a whip. "Because I find myself, Charles, remembering a great many small things tonight that never troubled me before. I remember you insisting no other physician ever examine me. I remember you managing every ledger, every account, without once showing me the full books. I remember a fire tonight in a stable, where you claimed a lantern was lit, that Elizabeth confirms was never lit at all. Small things. But they add up to something very large, don't they?" Charles Bennet rose from his chair slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of its earlier warmth. "You have no proof," he said, low and cold. "A bottle of tonic and the word of a disgraced healer's daughter. Take it to a magistrate, Nathaniel, and see how far it gets you against the word of a man this county has trusted for 2 decades. See how quickly they believe you over me." "Get out of my study," Nathaniel said. "This is still my house as much as—" "It is my house," Nathaniel said, rising unsteadily to his feet. "And it has been my house since I was 13 years old, though you have clearly spent 22 years hoping I'd forget it. Get out, Charles. You will not touch my medicine again. you will not manage my accounts again. And if I find one shred more proof of what I suspect tonight, I will see you hanged for what you did to my father, whatever it costs this family's name." Charles Bennet stood very still for a moment, his eyes moving between them with a coldness that made Elizabeth's skin prickle, and then without another word, he turned and walked out of the study. His footsteps unhurried, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who was all ready. She understood with dawning dread, calculating his next move, rather than accepting defeat. He did not wait long. By the following morning, whispers had already begun moving through the county, not about Foxglove, not about fire, but about the new Mrs. Whitmore's strange and sudden authority over her ailing husband, about a healer's ruined daughter who had somehow within a single week turned a dying man against the cousin who'd faithfully managed his affairs for over 2 decades. "She's bewitched him." Elizabeth overheard one of the kitchen maids whisper to another, not realizing she stood within earshot. "My mother says these healer women know things ordinary folk shouldn't trust. Charms and potions. Poor Mr. Bennet thrown out of his own home for nothing but loyalty." Elizabeth said nothing, only continued walking, though the words settled into her chest like stones. She had seen this before, the slow turning of a community's sympathy, the way a story could be reshaped in whispers until the victim became the villain and the villain became the wronged party, simply because one voice was better trusted than another. Charles Bennet understood exactly how that worked. He had, after all, spent 22 years perfecting it. She found Nathaniel in the garden that afternoon, staring out toward the tree line with an expression she hadn't seen since the wedding. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, the look of a man realizing the ground beneath him was less solid than he'd believed. "He's gone to town," Nathaniel said without turning. "Charles, left an hour ago. I don't know where." "You let him leave. On what grounds would I have stopped him?" "A bottle of tonic that could, as he said, simply be an error in measurement. I have no proof yet that would satisfy a magistrate, Elizabeth. Only suspicion and instinct, and the word of a wife the county already believes is unwell in the mind." He turned to look at her, and there was real fear in his face now, sharper than anything the illness itself had put there. "If he's gone to spread his own version of events before we can prove ours, then we need to move faster than he does," Elizabeth said. "I need the full medicine chest, every bottle, and I need someone besides myself and you to witness what I find someone. The county will believe over Charles's word. Is there a physician anywhere in this county who isn't beholden to him?" Nathaniel considered this, his brow furrowed. "Dr. Marsh, 2 counties over. My father used him once years ago before Charles insisted on Whitfield exclusively. He's old now, half retired, but he has no ties to this estate and no reason to lie for anyone. Send for him, today. And Nathaniel." She caught his hand the way she had in the garden days before, though this time he did not go rigid at the touch. This time his fingers closed around hers, steady and warm. "Whatever Charles is planning, whatever story he tells in town, you need to be seen. Strong, recovering. Every day you're too weak to leave this house is a day his version of events goes unchallenged." "I can barely stand some mornings," Nathaniel admitted quietly. "You know that better than anyone now." "Then we stop the Foxglove today, this hour, and in a week, you'll be stronger than you've been in 2 years, Elizabeth said. "Your body has been fighting a war you didn't know you were in, Nathaniel. Let it finally have a chance to win." The days that followed moved with a strange, taut urgency. Elizabeth stripping every trace of Foxglove from Nathaniel's diet and medicine, preparing his tonics herself from herbs she trusted. Watching with cautious hope as the gray pallor slowly began to lift from his face, as his hand steadied as he managed on the 4th day to walk the length of the garden without needing to stop and catch his breath against the fence. But the county's whispers grew louder, not quieter. Elizabeth heard them everywhere now, in the market, when she rode into town for supplies and felt eyes following her. Heard the word witch murmured behind a gloved hand. In the church pews, the following Sunday, where women who had once merely stared at her now turned their backs entirely when she approached. In the careful, pitying way, Mrs. Alden began watching her, as though bracing for a blow she couldn't prevent. "Charles has been busy," Mrs. Alden told her quietly the 9th night, catching Elizabeth alone in the kitchen. Telling folks in town you've turned Mr. Nathaniel against his own blood. Telling them your father's ruin wasn't the injustice you claim it was, that he truly was a fraud, and that his daughter learned his tricks well enough to fool a dying man into casting out the only family looking after his interests. Elizabeth's stomach turned cold. He's rewriting my father's story to poison mine. He's clever, ma'am. I won't pretend otherwise. Man's had 22 years practicing how to turn a room to his side. Then I'll need Dr. Marsh here faster than Charles expects, Elizabeth said, though her voice shook slightly with the admission of how precarious their position truly was. Proof is the only thing that will silence rumor, Mrs. Alden, and I don't yet have enough of it. Dr. Marsh arrived on the 11th day, a stooped, sharp-eyed man in his 60s who examined Nathaniel with careful, unhurried thoroughness, tested the confiscated bottles from the medicine chest with methodical precision, and finally, in the study where the confrontation with Charles had taken place 10 days before, delivered his verdict with the flat certainty of a man who had no reason to lie for anyone. Foxglove, he confirmed, in doses too small to be immediately lethal, but sustained over months, years. Perhaps, given the pattern you've described to me, more than sufficient to explain a slow cardiac decline that would present to any physician not specifically testing for it as an inherited wasting illness. I'd stake my reputation on it, Mr. Whitmore. Someone has been poisoning you carefully and patiently for a very long time. Nathaniel closed his eyes, and Elizabeth saw the full weight of it land on him at last. Not merely the danger, but the grief, the 22 years of trust, now curdling into something far uglier in memory. My father, he said hoarsely. Do you believe? I couldn't say with certainty after so many years, Dr. Marsh said, not unkindly. But the pattern your father's illness followed as you've described it to me bears troubling resemblance to what I've found in you. I'd say it's a question worth asking, Mr. Whitmore, even if the answer can never be fully proven now. It was, in its way, the confirmation Elizabeth had feared most, and needed most. Not merely that Nathaniel was in danger, but that this had happened before, that Charles Bennet had perhaps done this once already, and walked away with 22 years of unquestioned authority as his reward. We have proof now, she said quietly, once Dr. Marsh had gone to draft his written findings. A physician's testimony, the bottles themselves. It's enough to bring before a magistrate, isn't it? It's enough to begin asking questions, Nathaniel said. Whether it's enough to convict a man this county has trusted for 2 decades against my healer's daughter wife, whom half the county already believes bewitched him. I don't know, Elizabeth. Charles understood exactly what he was doing when he started those whispers before we had a single fact to answer them with. He was proven right within the week. The summons came on a warm, still evening, delivered by a writer from town, a formal letter sealed and precise, informing Nathaniel Whitmore that a hearing had been called before the county magistrate to address certain grave accusations that had reached his attention, and that all relevant parties, including Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore, were required to appear. Nathaniel read it twice, his face going pale, in a way that had nothing to do with Foxglove, and everything to do with dread. He's moved first, he said. Charles has gone to the magistrate before us, and God knows what version of events he's told. Elizabeth took the letter from his hands and read it herself, her chest tightening as she reached the final lines, an accusation laid formally against her of manipulating and endangering the health of her husband through unlicensed and unsanctioned administration of herbal substances, filed under sworn testimony from Charles Bennet, and corroborated the letter noted by the estate's long-standing physician, Dr. Whitfield. He's accusing me, Elizabeth said, the words tasting like ash. He's taken every true thing I did, every herb I gathered to save your life, and turned it into the very crime he committed himself. Elizabeth, he learned this from watching what happened to my father, she said, and her voice was shaking now, not with fear, but with a fury so old and so deep it frightened even her. He knows exactly how easily a county turns against a woman with no name left to protect her. He's not defending himself, Nathaniel. He's ensuring that whatever proof we bring forward, I'll be standing in the dock as the accused before I ever open my mouth to accuse him. Nathaniel reached for her hand, his grip fierce despite the weakness still lingering in his fingers. I won't let that happen. "You may not have a choice," Elizabeth said quietly, staring at the seal on the letter at Charles Bennet's careful, damning signature beneath it. "Not if the whole county has already decided the way they decided about my father exactly who the villain in this story is meant to be." Outside, the last light was fading from the tobacco fields, and somewhere beyond the estate walls, in a town that had spent 11 days listening to Charles Bennet's careful, poisonous whispers, a magistrate was already preparing to hear a case that would decide in the space of a single hearing whether the truth Elizabeth had risked everything to uncover would set her free or bury her exactly the way her father had been buried beneath a lie too well told to survive against. The 3 days before the hearing passed like a held breath. Elizabeth spent them the way her father had taught her to spend the worst days of his own ruin, not in panic, but in preparation, gathering every scrap of proof she could carry into that magistrate's chamber like a shield. She copied Dr. Marsh's written findings twice over in case one copy was somehow lost or stolen. She pressed Mrs. Alden for the names of every servant who might testify to Charles's exclusive control over the medicine chest. She wrote down in careful dated entries every symptom Nathaniel had shown in the 11 days since the foxglove had stopped the color returning to his face, the strength returning to his hands, the simple, undeniable fact of a man growing healthier by the day once the poison stopped. "That should matter," she said to Nathaniel the night before the hearing, spreading her notes across his study desk. "A man doesn't recover from a curse, Nathaniel. He recovers from the absence of poison. The magistrate has to see that." "The magistrate," Nathaniel said grimly, "is a man named Judge Harlan Pierce, who has dined at Charles's table more times than I can count, and who has never once in 20 years ruled against a Bennet or a Whitmore in a matter of estate business. I don't say that to frighten you. I say it because you deserve to walk into that room knowing exactly how steep the ground beneath us truly is." Elizabeth absorbed this the way she absorbed every hard truth without flinching, filing it away as one more fact to plan around rather than one more reason to despair. "Then we don't rely on the judge's fairness," she said. "We rely on proof so plain that fairness becomes irrelevant. What does Charles stand to gain precisely if I'm found guilty of endangering you?" "Guardianship," Nathaniel said slowly, working through it as he spoke. "If my wife is proven a danger to me, unfit, unstable, a poisoner in her own right, the magistrate could order her removed from this house, perhaps imprisoned, and Charles would argue convincingly that I remain too weak and too poorly judged in character to manage the estate alone. He'd petition for reinstatement as steward. Full authority restored with the added benefit that this time no one questions his medicine again because the woman who questioned it has already been discredited as a madwoman. He's not just trying to save himself," Elizabeth said, the full shape of it settling cold in her chest. "He's trying to finish what he started at the wedding. If I'm removed from this house, Nathaniel who protects your tea, then—" Neither of them said the rest of it aloud. They didn't need to. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and close, the kind of humid Virginia summer heat that pressed down on the skin like a warning. Elizabeth dressed in her plainest gown, not out of humility, but out of calculation, because she had learned long ago that a woman dressed too finely invited suspicion of vanity, and a woman dressed too poorly invited suspicion of desperation, and she needed today to look like exactly what she was. A healer's daughter. Nothing more, nothing less, and unashamed of either. The county courthouse was smaller than the church had been, but it felt somehow far more crowded, every bench packed with faces Elizabeth recognized from the wedding, from the market, from the church pews that had turned their backs on her in the week since. She felt their eyes on her the moment she stepped through the door, felt the low murmur that followed her down the aisle like a current. Charles Bennet sat at the front, composed and immaculate, Dr. Whitfield beside him, wearing the grave, sorrowful expression of a physician forced by conscience to speak an unpleasant truth. When Elizabeth's eyes met Charles's across the room, he offered her the faintest, coldest smile, the smile of a man who believed entirely that he had already won. Judge Harlan Pierce called the hearing to order with the brisk efficiency of a man who had somewhere better to be, and Elizabeth understood watching him exactly how right Nathaniel had been to warn her. "We are here," the judge announced, "to examine grave accusations concerning the health and safety of Mr. Nathaniel Whitmore and the conduct of his wife, Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore, in administering unlicensed remedies without proper medical sanction. Mr. Bennett, you brought this matter before the court. You may proceed." Charles rose with the unhurried confidence of a man who had rehearsed every word. "Your Honor," he began, his voice pitched perfectly for sorrow rather than accusation. "I do this with a heavy heart, for I love my cousin Nathaniel as though he were my own son, and it grieves me beyond words to stand here today. But I cannot in good conscience watch a woman endanger him further without speaking what I've witnessed." He painted it beautifully. Elizabeth had to admit that even as her stomach turned with each careful word. He described her as a woman of unstable temperament prone to wild accusations who had struck a glass from her own husband's hand at their wedding in front of the entire county, an act he suggested delicately that spoke more to instability than to genuine concern. He described her nightly wanderings through the house, her secretive gathering of herbs, her insistence on preparing medicine herself despite having no formal training, no license, nothing but her ruined father's dubious reputation to recommend her judgment. Her own father, Charles said, his voice dropping with practiced regret, was tried in this very county, was he not, for the death of a patient under his care? I take no pleasure in raising it. But a daughter raised at the knee of a man convicted of medical malpractice, now secretly dosing my cousin with unlicensed remedies of her own devising. I ask the court respectfully whether that pattern does not deserve scrutiny. A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Elizabeth felt it like a blow. Convicted. Her father had never been convicted of anything. He had been ruined by rumor and driven to his grave by a mob of accusation before any trial had run its course, and Charles knew that difference perfectly well and had chosen his words to erase it entirely. "That's a lie," she said before she could stop herself, rising halfway from her seat. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge said sharply, "you will have your turn to speak. Sit down." She sat, her hands clenched white in her lap, and forced herself to breathe, to wait, to remember that her father had taught her patience was its own kind of strength, even when every instinct screamed to fight. Dr. Whitfield testified next, and his testimony was worse. A physician's careful, credentialed voice lending weight to every insinuation Charles had made. He described Elizabeth's interference in Nathaniel's treatment, her removal of his prescribed tonics, her substitution of unproven herbal remedies. He noted with grave professional concern that Mr. Whitmore's symptoms had grown erratic in the weeks since his marriage. Conveniently omitting, Elizabeth noted with rising fury that erratic had meant improving, that the color had returned to Nathaniel's face precisely because the foxglove had stopped. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Whitfield concluded, "Mrs. Whitmore's unsanctioned interference poses a genuine risk to Mr. Whitmore's continued survival." The courtroom murmured its agreement, and Elizabeth felt the ground beneath her tilting exactly the way Nathaniel had warned it would. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Pierce said when Dr. Whitfield had stepped down, "you may now respond to these accusations." Elizabeth rose. Her legs were unsteady, but her voice when it came was not. "Your Honor," she said, "I would like to begin by correcting a falsehood. My father was never convicted of anything. He was accused, and before a trial could determine the truth, a mob of frightened, grieving people drove him from his home and his livelihood on rumor alone, and he died of a broken heart in a debtor's cell before the truth could ever be properly examined. I say this not to relitigate my father's ruin, but because I recognize sitting in this courtroom today the exact same pattern unfolding against me. An accusation delivered with great sorrow and apparent reluctance, designed to convict in the court of public opinion before a single fact has been properly tested." She reached into the small case beside her and withdrew Dr. Marsh's written findings, holding them aloft for the courtroom to see. "I did not act alone, nor in secret, nor without proper medical judgment. 11 days ago, my husband and I brought in an independent physician, Dr. Josiah Marsh of Chesterfield County, a man with no ties to this estate, no history with either Mr. Bennett or myself, and nothing whatsoever to gain from his findings. Dr. Marsh examined the very medicine Mr. Bennett has personally administered to my husband for the past 2 years, and found conclusively the presence of foxglove, a substance capable of producing exactly the wasting symptoms my husband has suffered in doses too small to kill outright, but more than sufficient to slowly, patiently poison a man over months and years. The courtroom erupted into noise. Judge Pierce banged his gavel demanding order, and Elizabeth saw for one unguarded instant real alarm flicker across Charles Bennet's composed face before he smoothed it away. "Your Honor," Charles said quickly, rising. "This is precisely the kind of wild, unfounded accusation I warned the court of. A woman desperate to deflect suspicion from her own conduct, now inventing a conspiracy against a man who has served this family faithfully for—" "I have Dr. Marsh's sworn written testimony," Elizabeth said, cutting across him, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. "I have my own detailed records kept daily documenting my husband's health before and after the foxglove was removed from his diet. And I would ask the court one simple question which I believe Mr. Bennet will find considerably harder to answer than he has found it to slander my father's memory." She turned to face Charles directly. "If the foxglove in that tonic was, as you claim, a simple, innocent error in dosage, why in 2 years of my husband's declining health did you never once permit a second physician to examine him? Why did you personally measure every dose every night with your own hand, trusting no servant and no physician but Dr. Whitfield, whom you yourself selected and paid? And why, Mr. Bennet, on the very night my husband's suspicions were finally confirmed, did the stable catch fire, the same stable where a servant boy who might have witnessed something inconvenient to you was sleeping?" The courtroom had gone entirely silent now, every eye moving between Elizabeth and Charles Bennet, with the hungry attention of an audience that sensed finally the true shape of the story beginning to emerge from beneath its careful disguise. Charles's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "I resent the implication that I would ever endanger a child. Then perhaps," Elizabeth said, "Tommy the stable boy would be willing to tell the court himself what he saw that night before the fire started. He's just outside, Your Honor, waiting to be called if the court will permit it. It was a risk." She hadn't been entirely certain, until the words left her mouth, that Tommy would agree to testify, a 12-year-old servant boy asked to speak against the man who employed his family in a courtroom full of powerful strangers. But Mrs. Alden had spoken to him the night before gently, and the boy had remembered with the particular clarity of a child who had nearly died in a fire. He didn't start something he hadn't thought to mention until someone finally asked. Judge Pierce, his earlier certainty visibly wavering, permitted the boy to be called. Tommy entered the courtroom, small and frightened, his splinted arm still bound. His eyes wide at the crowd of unfamiliar faces. But when he found Elizabeth's face among them, something in his shoulders steadied. "Tell the court," the judge said, not unkindly, "what you saw the night of the stable fire." Tommy swallowed hard. "I seen Mr. Bennet," he said, his young voice carrying further than he seemed to expect in the hushed room. "Coming from the stable about an hour before the fire started. I was half asleep in the loft and didn't think nothing of it at first, on account of Mr. Bennet owns near everything on this estate and going wherever he pleases. But there weren't no lantern lit when he left. I remember 'cause it was dark as pitch when I went to check on the horses after, and I had to feel my way to the water trough." "You're certain of the time?" the judge asked. "Yes, sir. The church bell had just struck the hour. I remember on account of I was counting the chimes to help myself fall back asleep." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom, and this time Elizabeth saw Charles Bennet's hand curl into a fist at his side, the first crack in 22 years of careful control. "A servant boy's memory of a dark night," Charles said, his voice tighter now, less smooth, "hardly constitutes proof of arson, Your Honor. Children misremember. They're frightened. They're eager to please whoever's kind to them." "Then let us set aside the fire entirely," Elizabeth said, "and return to the bottle itself. Your Honor, which requires no child's memory to examine only a chemist's honest testing. I would ask the court to summon its own independent examination of the tonic in question this very day, if Mr. Bennet is so confident that Dr. Marsh's findings are mistaken." Charles's face, for the first time in the entire hearing, showed something close to genuine panic beneath the composure. "That won't be necessary," he said quickly. "The bottle in question has already been disposed of, as is standard practice, with expired remedies." Convenient, Elizabeth said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore, the judge warned. Forgive me, Your Honor, but I would point out that I retained a second sample from the same batch sealed and dated precisely because I anticipated the original might not survive to be examined a second time. She withdrew the small brown bottle from her case and set it on the clerk's table before the judge, and the silence that fell over the courtroom in that moment was absolute. Judge Pierce stared at the bottle for a long moment, his expression shifting from irritation to something far more careful. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier briskness entirely. This court will recess for 1 hour, he announced, while the bottle is examined by an independent chemist of the court's own selection. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Whitmore, you will both remain present. The hour of recess was the longest of Elizabeth's life. She sat on a hard bench in the courthouse's small antechamber, Nathaniel beside her, his hand tight around hers, neither of them speaking, both of them watching the door through which the court's chosen chemist had disappeared with the sealed bottle. Across the room, Charles Bennett sat alone, his composure entirely gone. Now, his face gray and drawn in a way that told Elizabeth more plainly than any testimony could have exactly how much he understood he stood to lose. If this doesn't work, Nathaniel said quietly, if the chemist finds nothing or finds something ambiguous enough for Charles to argue his way free of it, then we find another way, Elizabeth said, though her own certainty was thinner than she let her voice betray. We don't stop Nathaniel, whatever happens today. He looked at her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Not fear, not gratitude, but something steadier and far more dangerous to her composure. I should have believed you at the wedding, he said. The moment you struck that glass, I spent days doubting the one person in this house who was only ever trying to save my life, and I am sorry for every hour of that doubt, Elizabeth. Whatever happens in there today, I need you to know that. Before Elizabeth could answer, the antechamber door opened and the clerk announced that the court was reconvening. The chemist's findings, when read aloud before the packed courtroom, confirmed everything Dr. Marsh had already found foxglove present in a concentration far beyond any accidental dosing error, consistent with sustained deliberate administration over an extended period. The courtroom erupted, and this time, Judge Pierce did not immediately call for order, his own face pale with the weight of what the finding implied. Mr. Bennett, the judge said finally, once the noise had settled, you administered this tonic personally by your own earlier testimony for a period of years. You alone controlled its preparation. You alone barred a second physician's examination of your cousin for the entirety of that period. The court would very much like to hear your explanation for how foxglove in a lethal accumulating dose came to be present in medicine you yourself prepared. Charles Bennett rose slowly, and for the first time in the entire hearing, Elizabeth saw the mask fall away, entirely revealing something colder and far more honest beneath it. Not grief, not loyalty, but a calculating fury directed squarely at the woman who had unraveled 22 years of careful patient work in the space of a few short weeks. You want the truth, he said, his voice suddenly flat and hard, stripped of every warm pretense he'd worn since the wedding day. Very well. The truth is that I have run this estate since Nathaniel was 13 years old, while he did nothing but inherit what I built with my own hands. The truth is that his father was a fool who nearly ran this family into ruin before I took the ledgers in hand and saved it. And the truth is that Nathaniel would have run it into the ground twice over by now if I'd ever handed him the reins. Charles, Nathaniel started, rising, his face white with shock. You want to know why? Charles said, turning on him now, 22 years of buried resentment finally breaking loose. Because I built this. Every acre, every account, every ounce of this family's wealth for 2 decades has passed through my hands while you sat sick and useless in that house, and I was to simply hand it all over to whatever wife you eventually married, whatever child she eventually bore you, and receive nothing for it but a steward's wages. Until I was too old to matter. I earned this estate, Nathaniel. I earned it with 22 years of my life, and I was not about to watch it pass to a woman who married you for the very fortune I built. So you poisoned him, Elizabeth said quietly into the horrified silence that followed. Slowly, patiently, The same way I suspect that you poisoned his father before him." Charles's eyes snapped to hers, and for just a moment the fury in them was so raw and so undisguised that Elizabeth felt Nathaniel's grip tighten protectively around her hand. His father, Charles said, was going to sell off half the estate's tobacco fields to fund some fool venture in shipping. I saved this family from his stupidity, and I was rewarded with 20 more years of servitude before I finally decided enough was enough. The confession hung in the courtroom air like smoke, undeniable, unretractable, and Elizabeth watched Judge Pierce's face shift from disbelief to grim dawning certainty as the true shape of 2 decades finally revealed itself before the entire county. "Charles Bennett," the judge said slowly, "you have just confessed before this court and dozens of witnesses to the attempted murder of Nathaniel Whitmore and implied strongly your involvement in the death of his father before him. I am ordering your immediate arrest, pending full investigation and trial." The courtroom dissolved into chaos, shouting, gasping, the scrape of benches as spectators rose to see better. And through it all, Charles Bennett stood motionless at the center of the storm. He'd finally catastrophically let loose. His eyes fixed on Elizabeth with a hatred so pure it made her skin crawl, even as 2 county deputies moved to restrain him. "This isn't finished," he said low and venomous as they led him past her. "You've made an enemy today, Healer's daughter. Enemies like me don't simply disappear because a magistrate says so." "Get him out of my courtroom," Judge Pierce said sharply, and the deputies obliged, hauling Charles Bennett through the courthouse doors and out into the gray afternoon light, his threats trailing behind him until the doors finally swung shut and silenced them entirely. Elizabeth stood in the sudden ringing quiet that followed her whole body, shaking with the release of 11 days of held tension, and felt Nathaniel's arms come around her before she fully understood she'd begun to sway on her feet. "It's over," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered to hide in front of the watching courtroom. "Elizabeth, it's over. You did it. You saved my life, and you proved it before God, and this entire county and I will spend the rest of whatever years you've given me back trying to deserve it." Around them, the courtroom that had whispered witch and madwoman for 11 long days had gone entirely silent, faces that had turned away from her in church, now watching with something closer to shame, and Elizabeth understood, even through the trembling relief flooding her chest, that the truth had finally, at devastating cost, been dragged into the light. But as the doors swung shut on Charles Bennett's departing threats, she could not quite shake the cold certainty that a man who had spent 22 years perfecting patience would not accept defeat as easily as a magistrate's ruling suggested he might. Charles Bennett's threats did not stay idle words for long. 3 days after the hearing, word reached the Whitmore estate that he had somehow secured release on bond, a detail that sent a fresh wave of cold dread through Elizabeth, even as Nathaniel raged at the injustice of it. "Bond," he said, pasting his study with an energy that would have been impossible for him a month earlier before the foxglove stopped. "A confessed poisoner and some magistrate's clerk with a debt to Charles's old favors sets bond low enough that he simply walks out the courthouse door." "Where is he now?" Elizabeth asked. "No one knows. Vanished from town the same night. Mrs. Alden's brother works at the livery, says Charles bought a horse under a false name and rode east before dawn." Elizabeth felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the particular vertigo of a threat that has gone from contained to loose in the world. "East. Toward Richmond." "Toward Richmond," Nathaniel confirmed grimly, "where half the county's wealthiest families keep their winter houses, and where a clever, well-spoken man, with 22 years of respectable history behind him, could very easily find sympathetic ears for whatever version of this story he decides to tell next." "He's not running," Elizabeth said, slowly understanding, arriving with the cold clarity of a held breath finally released. "He's regrouping." She was right, though it took another 8 days for the shape of Charles Bennett's regrouping to reveal itself, and when it did, it arrived not as violence, but as something far more insidious. A letter delivered to the county's leading families, printed and circulated with the careful anonymity of a man who understood exactly how gossip traveled faster and struck harder than any courtroom testimony ever could. Elizabeth read the pamphlet with her hands going numb around the paper. It painted Charles Bennet not as a poisoner, but as a tragic wronged man, a loyal steward destroyed by a conspiracy between a scheming bride and a husband too weak-minded and grief-addled to see the manipulation happening beneath his own roof. It suggested delicately that Elizabeth had poisoned Nathaniel herself, slowly, patiently, and had planted evidence against Charles when she sensed her scheme unraveling. It resurrected her father's ruin in vivid, damning detail, weaving a narrative of a family bloodline given to fraud and deception, a daughter who had learned her father's tricks well enough to snare a wealthy dying man and destroy an innocent guardian who dared to question her. "This is monstrous," Nathaniel said, reading over her shoulder, his voice shaking with fury. "He confessed Elizabeth, before God and half the county. How does he dare?" "Because a confession extracted in a moment of fury can be recast as a man driven to desperate words by grief and betrayal," Elizabeth said quietly. "He's clever, Nathaniel. He's had 22 years of practice turning the truth exactly sideways enough that it still resembles honesty to anyone who wants to believe him. And people, it seemed, wanted very much to believe him." The change came slowly, at first a neighboring family, declining an invitation. They'd previously accepted a shopkeeper in town, suddenly too busy to serve Elizabeth, promptly small slights that could each be explained away individually, but which gathered together painted an unmistakable picture of a community's sympathy shifting once again beneath her feet. "They want a villain," Elizabeth said one evening, staring out at the darkening tobacco fields from the study window. "And Charles has given them a far more comfortable one than the truth. A confessed poisoner is a monster too large and too frightening to hold in the mind for long. A conniving bride who tricked her way into wealth, that's a story people already know how to tell. It fits neater into what they already believed about a healer's ruined daughter." "It won't hold," Nathaniel said. The court's own chemist confirmed the foxglove, Tommy's testimony, Charles's own confession. "A confession given under the pressure of public exposure can be reframed as coerced," Elizabeth said. "I've watched this happen before, Nathaniel. I watched it happen to my father. The facts matter far less than which story people find easier to live with." She did not tell him that night about the letter that had arrived at the estate itself 2 days prior, unsigned, delivered by hand in the dead of night, and left tucked beneath the kitchen door where any servant might have found it first. She had burned it in the study fire before anyone else could read the words, but she had not been able to burn away the memory of them. "You proved nothing today that cannot be unproven tomorrow. I built this family's fortune while you were still learning to walk. I will not lose it to a healer's daughter with a nose for poison and nothing else to recommend her. Watch carefully, Elizabeth. The next accident will not miss." She kept the memory to herself, turning it over alone in the small hours, weighing whether telling Nathaniel would protect him, or simply add fear atop fear he had no power to act on. In the end, she decided silence would only make her complicit in whatever came next. And on the 10th night after the pamphlet's circulation, she told him everything. Nathaniel's face went the color of ash. "You should have told me the moment it arrived, and done what frightened you into locking every door in a house Charles knows better than either of us." "I needed to think, Nathaniel. I needed to understand what we were facing before I brought it to you as one more burden. We face it together," he said, gripping her hand hard enough to hurt. "That was the entire point of everything we've survived these past weeks, Elizabeth. You don't carry threats against your life alone in the dark and decide afterward whether I've earned the right to know about them." She looked at him, really looked the way she'd learned to read faces since childhood, searching not for deception now, but for the plain, unguarded truth of a man who had somewhere in the past month stopped being a stranger. She'd been sold to and become something else entirely. Something she did not yet have words steady enough to name. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." 2 days later, the true shape of Charles Bennet's counterattack finally revealed itself, and it arrived not through pamphlets or threats, but through the county sheriff himself, standing uncomfortable and apologetic on the Whitmore estate's front steps, with a fresh summons in his hand. "I'm sorry to bring this, Mr. Whitmore," the sheriff said, not meeting Nathaniel's eyes. "Mr. Bennet's filed a countersuit. Claims your wife administered dangerous substances to you under false pretense of medical necessity. and that the original hearing's findings were improperly influenced by testimony from an underage servant with reason to fear for his position if he testified against his mistress rather than his master. "That's absurd," Nathaniel said. "Tommy testified freely of his own will." "I understand, sir, but Mr. Bennett's retained counsel out of Richmond, expensive counsel, the kind that knows how to make a case sound complicated enough that a judge feels obligated to hear it properly rather than dismiss it outright. There's to be a second hearing. Full trial this time before a circuit judge rather than the county magistrate." Elizabeth felt the ground shift again beneath her. The particular exhaustion of a fight she'd believed won, suddenly reopening wider and more dangerous than before. "When?" she asked. 3 weeks' time," the sheriff said. "In Richmond itself. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, truly." He left, and Elizabeth stood in the doorway watching his horse recede down the long drive and felt something in her chest that was not quite despair, but stood very close beside it. "Richmond," she said, "where Charles has spent the past 3 weeks cultivating exactly the sympathy he needs. A circuit judge who's never met either of us, who'll hear Charles's expensive counsel argue that a servant boy was coerced and a healer's daughter poisoned her own husband to inherit his fortune." "We beat him once," Nathaniel said, though his voice carried less certainty than the words themselves. "We beat him in a courtroom he didn't control with a confession he didn't intend to give. He won't make that mistake twice. Richmond will be different, Nathaniel. Richmond will be exactly the fight he's had 3 weeks to prepare for, while we've had 3 weeks to simply survive his threats." They did not waste the 3 weeks that followed. Elizabeth wrote to Dr. Marsh, securing his commitment to travel to Richmond and testify in person. His written findings alone no longer sufficient against expensive Richmond counsel, skilled at picking apart absent witnesses. She wrote to Mrs. Alden's brother at the livery, securing a sworn statement about the horse Charles had purchased under a false name the night he fled. She spent long hours with Tommy and his family, gently, carefully making certain the boy understood he would not be forced to testify again if the fear of it was too much to bear, and was quietly, fiercely proud when the boy, jaw set with a courage well beyond his 12 years, insisted he would tell the truth again as many times as it took. But it was Nathaniel who found the piece of proof that would ultimately matter most. He came to her on the 18th day before the Richmond trial, a leather ledger clutched in his hands, his face pale with a discovery that had clearly cost him something to make. "I went through my father's old papers," he said. "Things I hadn't touched since his funeral, stored away in the attic because I couldn't bear to look at them." Elizabeth Wife found his account books, from the year before he died. He spread the ledger open on the desk between them, his finger tracing careful, faded handwriting. "Look here. Withdrawals in the months before his death that Charles's own later records never accounted for. Money moving out of the estate's accounts and into something my father simply labeled CB personal loan. Repeated month after month, larger each time. And here?" His finger moved to a final entry dated 3 weeks before his father's death. "My father wrote a note in the margin. Charles insists these are temporary. I begin to doubt it. Will raise with the attorney upon my return from Richmond." Elizabeth's breath caught. He never made it back from that trip. He died 2 weeks after writing this. Nathaniel said, his voice unsteady. The official account always said his heart simply gave out on the road home. But Elizabeth, what if he'd discovered exactly what you discovered in me? What if he was on his way to confront Charles, or worse, on his way to an attorney to expose him, and never survived the journey to do either? The implication sat between them, heavy and terrible. "We can't prove that," Elizabeth said carefully. "Not with certainty, not after 22 years. But we can prove the withdrawals. We can prove Charles was quietly draining money from this estate before your father's death, under an arrangement your father himself was beginning to doubt. That's not speculation, Nathaniel. That's a paper trail a Richmond judge can examine with his own eyes." Nathaniel closed the ledger slowly, his jaw tight with a grief that had waited 22 years to finally have a shape worth grieving. "He killed my father," he said quietly. "I feel it in my chest as certainly as I feel my own heartbeat, Elizabeth. even if we can never prove it in a court of law. Then we make certain, Elizabeth said, that whatever we cannot prove about your father, we prove beyond any doubt about you. We give this Richmond judge no room, no shadow of ambiguity, for Charles's expensive counsel to hide inside. The morning they departed for Richmond arrived cold for late summer, a thin mist clinging to the tobacco fields as their carriage rolled down the long drive. Dr. Marsh's own carriage following behind, with the sealed evidence carefully secured. Mrs. Alden waving from the front steps with an expression that mixed hope and dread in equal measure. "Whatever happens," Nathaniel said, watching the estate recede behind them, "I need you to know that these past 6 weeks, whatever fear and danger they've held, have also held more honesty than the previous 35 years of my life combined. I was a man half convinced he was already dying of nothing but bad luck and bad blood. You gave me back a reason to want to keep living, Elizabeth, before you'd even proven there was a reason to fight for it." Elizabeth felt something in her chest loosen at the words warm and unfamiliar after weeks of nothing but fear and calculation. "I didn't do it for gratitude," she said quietly. "I know," Nathaniel said. "That's precisely why I'm grateful." Richmond's courthouse was larger and colder than the county building had been, its halls thick with the particular hush of a place accustomed to weighing fortunes and reputations with equal indifference. Charles Bennet sat at the defendant's no. Elizabeth corrected herself grimly at the plaintiff's table, immaculately dressed, flanked by 2 sharp-eyed Richmond attorneys. His composure entirely restored his earlier fury from the county hearing, nowhere visible in his calm, sorrowful expression. He looked, Elizabeth thought, exactly like a wronged man. That was, she understood now, precisely the point. The circuit judge, a stern, silver-haired man named Judge Ashworth Cole, who had clearly heard the pretrial summary of accusations and counter-accusations, with the weary patience of a man who'd seen 1,000 family fortunes fought over in his courtroom, called the proceedings to order, with a briskness that offered neither side any early comfort. Charles's Richmond attorney opened smoothly, painting a picture Elizabeth had half expected, but which still landed like a blow. Elizabeth Whitmore, desperate and impoverished, following her father's public disgrace. Marrying a wealthy dying man, not from any genuine care, but from calculated opportunity, slowly poisoning him herself, while cleverly, patiently constructing evidence to frame the one-man position to expose her scheme. A servant boy, coerced by fear of losing his position. A confession extracted under public pressure and humiliation not freely given. A pattern of behavior, the attorney argued, entirely consistent with a woman raised by a father who had himself deceived and endangered patients under the guise of healing. The defense, the attorney concluded, will show that Mrs. Whitmore is not the hero of this story. Her testimony would have this court believe. She is in fact its true villain, a woman who has learned from a lifetime at her father's side precisely how to weaponize the appearance of care to conceal genuine harm. Elizabeth felt Nathaniel's hand find hers beneath the table, gripping hard, and she made herself breathe evenly, made herself remember every hard-won lesson her father had taught her about facing a room that had already decided who you were. Patience. Evidence. Truth laid out plainly enough that even people who wish to disbelieve it cannot look away from it entirely. When her turn came to respond, she did not raise her voice, did not let fury shape a single word. She simply laid out methodically everything they had gathered. Dr. Marsh's testimony, given now in careful, unshakable person, rather than mere written record. The chemist's original findings, confirmed and cross-examined. Tommy's account delivered again with the same simple, unshaken courage. This time under far more hostile questioning from Charles's Richmond counsel, questioning the boy withstood with a steadiness that visibly impressed even the skeptical judge. And then finally she produced the ledger. "This is Mr. Whitmore's father's own hand," she said, passing the leather book to the clerk, recording withdrawals to Charles Bennet labeled as personal loans in the months preceding his death, withdrawals never repaid, never accounted for in any subsequent estate record. Mr. Bennet himself prepared as steward, and here in the elder Mr. Whitmore's own handwriting 3 weeks before his sudden death, a note expressing growing doubt about those very withdrawals, and an intention to raise the matter with an attorney upon his return from a trip he never survived to complete. The courtroom's attention sharpened palpably. Charles's composure for the first time since the trial began flickered. "Your Honor," his attorney interjected quickly. "This is pure speculation regarding an unrelated death 22 years past, entirely irrelevant to the current." "It is entirely relevant," Judge Cole said, his voice cutting through the objection with quiet authority. "To establishing a pattern of conduct, Counselor, which this court is well within its rights to consider." "Continue, Mrs. Whitmore." Elizabeth continued laying out the timeline with the same patient precision she'd once used to catalog her father's herb stores. The foxglove, the years of controlled access, the fire that conveniently silenced a witness. The same night suspicion first crystallized the flight from the county, the moment confession became public record. The pamphlet campaign designed not to prove innocence, but to poison public sympathy before facts could be properly weighed. "Mr. Bennett would have this court believe," she said finally, "that a woman with no formal education, no legal training, and no resources beyond what little her ruined father left her, somehow orchestrated a conspiracy elaborate enough to poison her husband, frame an innocent steward, coerce a child's testimony, and forge financial records spanning 22 years, all within the span of 6 weeks since her wedding day. I would ask this court respectfully, which explanation truly strains credibility more? That a desperate woman achieved all of that in 6 weeks? Or that a man who has controlled every account, every physician, and every dose of medicine in this household for 22 uninterrupted years found it considerably easier to hide a much simpler truth? The silence that followed held a different quality than it had at the county hearing. Not the shocked gasp of a community discovering scandal, but the heavier, more considered silence of a courtroom, genuinely weighing evidence rather than gossip. Charles Bennett's attorneys pressed hard through cross-examination, seizing on every small uncertainty, every gap, 22 years, and one destroyed piece of evidence had left unaccounted for. They painted Dr. Marsh as an old half-retired physician, eager for relevance. They painted Tommy as a frightened child who might say anything to please the mistress who'd saved his arm, and by extension, his livelihood. They painted the ledger as ambiguous, the ambiguous handwriting of a man 22 years dead, who could no longer clarify his own meaning. Elizabeth watched Judge Cole's face throughout searching for any sign of which way the weight was settling, and found to her growing dread an expression giving away almost nothing at all. "This court," Judge Cole finally announced when both sides had exhausted their arguments, "will take the remainder of the day to consider the full weight of evidence presented. We will reconvene tomorrow morning with a ruling." It was Elizabeth understood. As she walked out of the courthouse into the gray Richmond evening, the longest possible answer to the shortest possible question, whether 22 years of careful respectability could still outweigh 6 weeks of desperate, hard-won truth. That night, in the small rented room they'd taken near the courthouse, Nathaniel found Elizabeth standing at the window, staring out at Richmond's unfamiliar lights, her arms wrapped tight around herself in a posture he recognized now as the one she wore when fear finally caught up to the composure she showed everyone else. "You did everything humanly possible," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Whatever the ruling tomorrow, Elizabeth, you fought harder for the truth than anyone had a right to ask of you. If he wins," she said, not turning from the window, "he doesn't simply walk free, Nathaniel. He proves before an entire courtroom that the story he spent 3 weeks telling is the true one. He proves that women like me, women with ruined names and no protection beyond our own persistence, will always lose eventually to men clever enough and patient enough to rewrite the truth in their own favor. My father lost that fight. If I lose it too in the same manner to the same kind of man, you are not your father's failure," Nathaniel said, turning her gently to face him. "You are the reason his failure didn't repeat itself. Whatever happens tomorrow, Elizabeth, you have already done what he couldn't. You made them listen. You made a courtroom examine the truth instead of simply believing the loudest, wealthiest voice in the room. That matters regardless of what Judge Cole decides tomorrow morning." Elizabeth studied his face in the low candlelight, the man who had been 6 weeks ago a stranger she'd been sold to for the sake of her family's desperate finances, now standing before her with a tenderness that had nothing left in it, of arrangement or obligation. I was so afraid, she admitted quietly, of caring what happened to you. It felt safer to see this marriage as a bargain, a transaction, something I could survive without truly risking my heart in it. But somewhere in these 6 weeks, Nathaniel, I stopped being able to hold that distance. And now I stand here, the night before a verdict that could take everything, and I find I'm not only afraid of losing my freedom, I'm afraid of losing you. Nathaniel's hand rose to cup her face, gentle and unsteady. Then let us be afraid together tonight, he said, and face tomorrow, whatever it brings, as exactly what we've become to each other. Not a bargain, not an arrangement, but two people who found something neither of us expected to survive long enough to find. Judge Cole's courtroom was packed to capacity the following morning. Word of the previous day's dramatic testimony, having traveled through Richmond's social circles overnight, with the particular speed reserved for scandal involving wealth and poison in equal measure. Elizabeth sat beside Nathaniel, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and watched Judge Cole take his seat with an expression that gave away nothing more this morning than it had the evening before. This court, he began, has considered carefully the evidence and testimony presented across 2 days of proceedings in both the original county hearing and this Richmond trial. I will not pretend the matter before me has been simple. 22 years of a man's respected service stand against 6 weeks of a woman's desperate, largely uncorroborated claims, and this court's obligation is to weigh fact against fact, not sentiment against sentiment. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten with each measured word, unable to read yet which direction the verdict was leaning. However, Judge Cole continued, I find the independent chemical analysis of the tonic in question to be conclusive and unimpeachable. I find Dr. Marsh's testimony credible and disinterested. I find the testimony of the servant boy Thomas consistent under hostile cross-examination in a manner inconsistent with coaching or coercion. And I find the financial ledger presented by Mr. Whitmore, while not conclusive proof of his father's murder 22 years past, deeply troubling, as evidence of a sustained pattern of financial deception by Mr. Bennett spanning over 2 decades. The courtroom had gone entirely silent, every breath held. Most damning of all, the judge said, his voice hardening, is the plaintiff's own conduct following the original county. Hearing a flight from the jurisdiction under a false name, followed by a public pamphlet campaign designed not to clarify facts, but to inflame public sentiment prior to formal legal proceedings. This is not the conduct of an innocent man wrongly accused. This is the conduct of a man attempting to win through public manipulation what he could not win through honest evidence. Charles Bennett's face had gone entirely rigid, his earlier composure crumbling by visible degrees with every sentence. It is the ruling of this court, Judge Cole announced, that the countersuit brought by Charles Bennett against Elizabeth Whitmore is dismissed in its entirety, and that the original county hearing's finding of attempted poisoning against Mr. Bennett is upheld and referred immediately to criminal proceedings. Furthermore, given the evidence presented regarding financial irregularities spanning Mr. Bennett's tenure as estate steward, I am ordering a full forensic audit of the Whitmore estate accounts under Mr. Bennett's management and remanding Mr. Bennett into custody, effective immediately pending trial on charges of attempted murder and grand fraud. The courtroom exploded into sound, gasps, murmurs, the scrape of benches as spectators rose in a rush of stunned reaction. And through it all, Elizabeth felt Nathaniel's arms come around her, felt her own tears finally break free. After 6 weeks of carefully held composure, felt something in her chest unclench that had been wound tight since the moment she'd smelled bitterness beneath sweetness in a wedding cup. Charles Bennett did not go quietly this time. 2 deputies moved to restrain him as he rose, his face contorted with a fury that had finally entirely abandoned every pretense of the loyal grieving steward he'd performed for 6 weeks. You have no idea what you've cost me, he snarled, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth with a hatred that made the courtroom fall momentarily silent again. 22 years and a healer's ruined daughter takes it from me in 6 weeks. You took it from yourself, Charles. Nathaniel said, his voice steady and clear, cutting across the courtroom, with the authority of a man who had finally fully stepped into the role his father's death had left waiting for him 22 years too long. Every dose of foxglove, every lie, every threat against my wife. You built your own downfall one poisoned cup at a time, and all Elizabeth did was refuse to let you finish pouring it. The deputies led Charles Bennett from the courtroom, his final threats trailing behind him and dissolving this time into nothing more than the empty noise of a man whose power had finally irreversibly run out. Elizabeth stood in the aftermath, Nathaniel's arms still around her, the weight of 6 impossible weeks finally beginning to lift from her shoulders, and understood with a clarity that settled deep and warm in her chest that for the first time since her father's ruin, the truth had not merely survived. It had won. The ride back to the Whitmore estate felt different than the one that had carried them away from it 18 days before. Elizabeth sat beside Nathaniel in the carriage, her hand resting easy in his, rather than clenched with dread, watching Virginia's late summer countryside roll past the window with a lightness in her chest she barely recognized after 6 weeks of carrying fear like a second skin. Dr. Marsh's carriage followed behind the physician, having insisted on personally overseeing Nathaniel's continued recovery for another fortnight, before returning to Chesterfield County. And somewhere behind that, a third carriage carried the forensic auditors Judge Cole had ordered to comb through 22 years of Charles Bennett's careful bookkeeping. "You're quiet," Nathaniel said, studying her face. "I keep waiting to feel it," Elizabeth admitted. "The relief. Everyone keeps telling me it's over, and some part of me believes them, but another part keeps listening for his footsteps outside my door the way I did every night these past weeks." "That part will quiet in time," Nathaniel said gently. "Fear doesn't leave the moment danger does. It takes its own time catching up to the truth." She looked at him, faintly surprised. "You sound like you know that from experience." "I spent 2 years believing I was already half a ghost," he said. "It took more than a magistrate's ruling to convince my own body I might actually live. I imagine your fear will take some convincing too." He was right, though it took the estate itself rising white and familiar through the trees, as their carriage finally turned up the long drive to begin the work of convincing her. Mrs. Alden was waiting on the front steps before the carriage had fully stopped. Her broad face already wet with tears, she made no effort to hide, and behind her spilling out the front doors in a rush that violated every rule of proper household decorum, came half the staff. Tommy at the front, his splinted arm healed enough now that he ran without favoring it. The kitchen maid whose mother's cough Elizabeth had treated grooms and washwomen, and the cook who'd once eyed her with open suspicion. All of them crowding the drive with the particular joy of people who had spent weeks fearing the worst, and were only now permitting themselves to believe otherwise. "We heard," Mrs. Alden said, pulling Elizabeth into an embrace that smelled of flower and lavender and every ounce of warmth Elizabeth had not realized until this moment she'd been starving for since her father's death. "Ryder came through from town not 2 hours past, said the Richmond judge threw the case out, and sent Mr. Bennett off in chains. Lord child, we've been beside ourselves." "It's true," Elizabeth said, laughing through sudden unexpected tears of her own. "It's over, Mrs. Alden. Truly over." Tommy pushed forward, his young face split with an unguarded grin. "Told everybody you'd win, ma'am. Told 'em straight." "You did more than tell them, Tommy," Elizabeth said, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. "You stood up in a courtroom full of strangers twice over and told the truth when it would have been far easier to stay quiet. That took more courage than most grown men in that room could have managed." The boy flushed with pride, and Elizabeth felt Nathaniel's hand settle warm at the small of her back, and understood, standing in the golden late afternoon light, with the whole household gathered around her in genuine relief, rather than wary suspicion that something fundamental had shifted not merely in the courts, but here in this house, in the way these people now looked at the woman they'd once whispered was mad or bewitched or dangerous. She had become somewhere in these 6 weeks something she had not been since her father's ruin. She had become trusted. The weeks that followed carried their own quieter dramas, the forensic audit into Charles Bennett's 22 years of stewardship, which uncovered a labyrinth of misdirected funds, inflated expenses, and quietly siphoned profits that had, by careful estimate, cost the Whitmore estate nearly a third of its rightful wealth over 2 decades. The criminal trial that followed the civil ruling brief, and largely a formality, given the overwhelming evidence already established, ending in a conviction that would see Charles Bennett spend the remainder of his life in a Richmond prison, his carefully built reputation dismantled as thoroughly and publicly as he had once tried to dismantle Elizabeth's. She did not attend the sentencing. Nathaniel offered gently to spare her the ordeal entirely, but Elizabeth found she needed to see it through to its end, needed perhaps some final accounting for her father's sake as much as her own. Charles Bennett looked older in the Richmond courtroom that final day, stripped of the composure that had carried him through decades of careful manipulation, his eyes finding hers across the room, with a bitterness that had nowhere left to go. "You could have simply stayed quiet," he said when the bailiffs paused to let him pass near her on his way to the transport wagon. "Accepted the marriage, the money, the comfortable life it offered you. Instead, you tore apart everything I built." "You didn't build it, Mr. Bennett," Elizabeth said quietly. "You stole it one small deception at a time from 2 generations of men who trusted you. I didn't tear anything apart that wasn't already rotten at its foundation. I only made certain the rot couldn't spread any further." He had no answer for that. The bailiffs led him away, and Elizabeth watched him go without triumph, only a kind of somber, hard-won peace, the particular peace of a woman who had finally, after everything, seen the truth outlast the lie that had tried so hard to bury it. Autumn came to the Whitmore estate with a gentleness that felt to Elizabeth like the whole world exhaling alongside her. Nathaniel's recovery continued steadily, the last traces of gray fading from his face, his strength returning fully enough that by the first frost he could walk the entire perimeter of the tobacco fields without pausing for breath, could ride again for the first time in 2 years. Could laugh. Really laugh. Unguarded and easy. In a way Elizabeth suspected he hadn't allowed himself since his father's death. "I keep forgetting I'm not dying," he told her one crisp October morning, breathless from an easy gallop across the east pasture, his cheeks flushed with color that had nothing to do with illness. "Some mornings I wake and reach for the weakness out of habit, and it simply isn't there anymore. It's the strangest thing, Elizabeth. Learning to expect to live." "You'll grow accustomed to it," she said, echoing with a small smile the words he'd once offered her about fear. He caught her hand, drawing her close in the cool morning air, and there was nothing tentative left in the way he looked at her now. None of the wary suspicion of their wedding day, none of the cautious gratitude of those first uncertain weeks. Only something steady and certain that had been built slowly and honestly out of 6 weeks, that had asked more of both of them than either had believed they could survive. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that I should have told you the day you struck that glass from my hand if I'd had the sense to recognize it then. I didn't marry you for love, Elizabeth. I married a stranger because my family's finances demanded an heir before my supposed illness finished its work, and I expected nothing from the arrangement beyond dutiful civility at best. I never imagined I'd find in a bargain neither of us chose the truest partnership of my life." "Nathaniel, let me finish," he said, gentle but insistent. "You saved my life before you had any reason to care whether I lived or died. You fought a county's worth of whispers and a man who threatened your very life, and never once wavered from the truth, even when the truth cost you everything the world was prepared to take from you. I don't simply love you, Elizabeth Whitmore. I am in awe of you, and I would spend the rest of whatever years this second chance affords me trying to be a husband worthy of the wife who gave it to me." Elizabeth felt tears rise unbidden and entirely unguarded, standing in the cool autumn light, with the man who had once been a stranger, and had become through fire and poison and courtrooms and quiet, unhurried trust the truest home she had known since her father's death. "I love you too," she said simply. "I think I have for longer than I let myself admit. It felt safer for a long while to call this duty rather than love. But it was never only duty, Nathaniel. Not since the fire, if I'm honest. Perhaps not since the wedding itself." She did not forget her father, not in the relief of victory, not in the warmth of a marriage that had grown into something neither of them had dared hope for. If anything, the memory of him sharpened in the aftermath, and it was that memory more than any lingering fear that shaped what Elizabeth chose to build next. "I want to open a proper healing house," she told Nathaniel one evening, the idea having taken clearer shape in her mind over weeks of quiet consideration. Not merely for the estate's servants, though certainly for them first. For the whole county. A place where ordinary families, the ones who can't afford Dr. Whitfield's fees, or who've been failed by physicians more concerned with reputation than with genuinely helping the people who trust them, can receive honest care from someone who won't judge them by their name or their purse. "Named for your father?" Nathaniel asked. "Named for the truth he tried to practice even when the world refused to believe him capable of it," Elizabeth said. "The Carter House, a place where knowledge is shared honestly and no one's worth is measured by their family's reputation or their bank account." Nathaniel did not hesitate. "Then we build it," he said. "Whatever it costs, whatever land it requires. You've spent your whole life watching your father's honest work go unrewarded by a world too quick to judge him. Let's build something that finally rewards it properly." The Carter House rose on the edge of the Whitmore estate through the following spring, a modest but sturdy building stocked with the herbs and remedies Elizabeth had learned at her father's side, staffed eventually by two young women from town whom Elizabeth trained personally in the careful patient work of true healing, rather than the performative gentility Dr. Whitfield had practiced for 15 empty years. Tommy, his arm fully healed, and strong, became something of an unofficial guardian of the place, running errands and fetching supplies, with the same fierce loyalty he'd shown Elizabeth since the night she'd carried him from a burning stable. And when Elizabeth watched him greet frightened, uncertain patients at the door, with the same gentle reassurance she'd once offered him, she felt something in her chest settle into a shape that finally truly resembled peace. Word of the Carter House spread slowly through the county, at first, then with growing speed as its reputation for honest, effective care outpaced the wariness that had once surrounded Elizabeth's name. Families who had once whispered witch and madwoman began arriving at its doors with sick children and aching joints, and the particular desperation of people who'd learned to distrust physicians who charged handsomely for remedies that rarely worked, and left more often than not genuinely helped and genuinely grateful. The whispers that followed Elizabeth now carried a different shape entirely. "Mrs. Whitmore saved my boy's leg when Dr. Whitfield said it'd have to come off," she overheard one farmer's wife telling another at the county market the following autumn. "Cleaned it proper, packed it with her herbs, and now he's running about like nothing ever happened. Don't know what folks were saying about her a year back, but I'll trust that woman with my children's lives over any physician in this county." Elizabeth did not correct the woman, did not announce her presence within earshot. She simply carried the words home with her quiet and warm, one more small proof that the truth, given enough time and enough courage to defend it, eventually outlasted even the most carefully constructed lie. A year to the day after the wedding that had begun. Everything, the poisoned wine, the shattered glass. The wide-eyed church full of guests who'd believed her mad. Elizabeth stood once more before the altar of St. Andrew's, though this time the church was decorated not for a hollow arrangement, but for a celebration. The entire county seemed to have turned out for eager this time to witness, rather than merely gossip. It was not a second wedding precisely. Nathaniel had insisted quietly and with a tenderness that had moved her to tears when he'd first proposed it on renewing their vows before the community, that had once so readily believed the worst of her, not to erase what had happened, but to stand together publicly and unashamed as exactly what they had become to one another. A year ago. Nathaniel said, his voice carrying clear through the packed church, his hand steady in Elizabeth's. "I stood in this very spot, believing myself a dying man, bound to a stranger by nothing more than financial necessity. I did not understand that day that the woman marrying me had already saved my life before the ceremony even concluded, and would go on saving it in ways both large and small, for every day that followed. I do not make these vows today out of obligation as I did the first time. I make them because Elizabeth Whitmore is the truest, bravest, most extraordinary person I have ever known, and I would choose her again freely and completely in every version of this life I might have lived. Elizabeth felt tears slide freely down her face, no longer needing, as she once had, to hide her emotion behind careful composure. "A year ago," she said when it was her turn, "I married a man I barely knew in a bargain, born of my family's ruin and his family's desperation. And I told myself I would survive it, the way I'd survived everything else, through vigilance, through caution, through never quite letting myself hope for more than mere survival. I did not expect to find in that bargain a partner who would trust me when the entire world told him not to, who would fight beside me rather than simply be saved by me, who would teach me that love could be built as carefully and as honestly as any healing patiently, truthfully, one trustworthy day at a time. I choose you, Nathaniel, not out of duty, out of love, freely given and gladly renewed." The church erupted into applause that had nothing performative in it, unlike the careful, watchful silence of a year before, genuine, warm, unreserved, and Elizabeth, looking out over faces that had once turned away from her in suspicion, and now looked back with open affection, understood that she had won something far larger than a single courtroom victory. She had reclaimed her place in the world not by asking permission to belong, but by proving through action and courage and unrelenting honesty exactly what she had always been worth. Years passed, the way years do when a life has finally settled into its rightful shape, quietly, steadily marked by small joys rather than sudden crises. The Carter House grew from a single modest building into a respected institution, known throughout the county and beyond. Training a new generation of healers in the same honest, patient methods Elizabeth's father had once practiced and been destroyed for practicing too plainly, in a world unwilling then to trust a healer without a title or a fortune behind his name. Nathaniel, restored fully to health and to the vigor his illness had once stolen from him, took up the estate's management with a steady, careful hand that bore little resemblance to the passive, resigned man he'd been on his wedding day. He hired an honest steward, insisted on transparent books available to any family member who wished to review them, and made certain, in ways both large and small, that no single person would ever again hold the kind of unchecked, unquestioned authority over his family's fortune and health that Charles Bennet had wielded for 2 poisoned decades. They had children eventually, a daughter first, whom they named Margaret after Elizabeth's mother, and a son 2 years later, whom Nathaniel insisted on naming after Elizabeth's father over her own initial protests that the name carried too much old grief to bear. "It carries grief," Nathaniel agreed gently the evening they'd argued the matter, "but it also carries honor, Elizabeth. Your father deserves to be remembered for what he truly was, an honest man, destroyed by a world too quick to judge him, not merely mourned as a private sorrow you carry alone. Let our son carry his name forward into a world that finally knows better." Elizabeth had wept at that and agreed, and watched with quiet, aching pride as her son grew into a boy who asked with genuine curiosity rather than shame about the grandfather whose name he carried and who was told each time the true story. Not the rumor that had once destroyed a good man's reputation, but the honest account of a healer who had cared for people the world too often overlooked, and a daughter who had spent her whole life proving his memory right. On a warm summer evening some years later, Elizabeth stood on the porch of the Whitmore estate, watching her children chase fireflies across the same lawn where once she had gathered herbs alone, and afraid, uncertain whether she would survive the household she'd married into, or be destroyed by it the way her father had been destroyed by a world that judged too quickly and forgave too rarely. Nathaniel joined her, settling an arm around her shoulders, watching their children's laughter carry across the darkening fields. "Do you ever think of that day?" he asked quietly. "The wedding, the wine." "Often," Elizabeth admitted, "not with fear anymore. But I think of it sometimes and marvel at how close we both came to a very different life. If I hadn't trusted my own nose that day, if you hadn't believed me even reluctantly, even after everything told you not to, I think," Nathaniel said, "that some part of me knew even then that trusting you was the only sensible choice available to me, whatever the rest of the world believed. I simply needed the courage to admit it." Elizabeth leaned into him, watching Tommy grown now into a steady young man who managed the estate's stables with the same quiet competence Nathaniel had once shown him, still fiercely loyal to the family that had saved his life and given him purpose beyond it. Call out gently to her children, guiding them safely back toward the porch as the evening deepened toward true dark. The Carter house lights glowed warm and steady in the distance, a beacon her father would have been proud beyond words to see standing in his name, offering to a whole county the honest, patient care the world had once refused to believe he'd ever truly offered. A person's worth was never decided by the name Virginia society gave my father, Elizabeth said quietly, more to herself than to Nathaniel, though he heard every word and held her closer for it. It was decided by what he did with the knowledge he carried and the compassion he offered to people who had nowhere else to turn. I understand that now, in a way I couldn't when I was simply grieving him. He was never the ruined man they called him. He was the honest one in a world too frightened of honesty to recognize it while it still had the chance. Nathaniel pressed a kiss to her temple, and together they watched their children's fireflies blink gold against the deepening blue of a Virginia summer night, and Elizabeth understood with the same quiet, unshakable certainty that had once carried her through poison and fire, and courtrooms full of doubting strangers, that the truth she had fought so hard to defend had not merely survived. It had built a life. It had built a family. It had built out of the ashes of one man's ruin, a legacy that would outlast every lie ever told to bury it, and that she knew now would always be worth every single thing it had cost her to prove.